Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Research and Open Source, where we'll be talking about some of the broader movements in academia and the influences that they are going to have in the future on the open source community. First, here's a bit of an agenda. I'm going to start by going through the background of what Open RIT is and a little bit about who I am. Then I'm going to go through the context through some of these broader movements in academia and where they're coming from. Then I'm going to go through the discovery process for our open source community health analytics tool, Mystic, where we gathered most of the information for this talk. Then I'm going into a TLDR, a bit of a summary of what all of this means right now. And then I'm going to go through implications, which will cover what these movements could mean in the future. First, the background. So Open RIT is an academic open programs office. It's an open programs office as opposed to an open source program office because we work with more than just code and open source. We have some professors that come in with data projects. We have some professors that come in with maps and literature and all sorts of things. We support the development of all these different open research streams in whatever medium that entails, whether that's through GitHub or through one of the various open data sources, or even just helping them publish their papers and everything in a way that's easily accessible to other researchers in their community. Who am I? I am a product manager at Open RIT. I work with these various open research projects that come into our office through our fellowship program, and I help them increase their impact and dissemination in different open communities. I also support the development of Mystic, our open source community health analytics tool, which draws in data streams from different tools to gauge the level of impact and dissemination of different research projects. Context. All right. So what's happening? Academia is moving into the open. There have been movements by the National Science Foundation, NASA Institutes of Health, National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine to change the incentivization in research away from the kind of the siloed streams that we have now that really reward keeping your work to yourself and making sure that you publish anything novel before anyone else does, and then sharing it later, as you have time to do so. Moving from that kind of an environment to one where open work is more valued and your incentives, the things tied to your grant applications and your tenure applications and your promotions and all that, are instead connected to impact and dissemination metrics in the open. And this really copied similar movements in industry in groups like the To-Do group and Linux and Mozilla, where they kind of work with different open source communities to benefit their own businesses. So now we're going to see similarly modeled after those industry groups, open academic work being supported by academic open programs offices. So once again, that's slightly different from how it's in industry where they do open source program offices because it's just code. In academia, this work encompasses many different fields, and so it's a bit of a branding issue why we call it open programs office, but that's what it's called. Specifically with the intent of increasing dissemination and impact in the open, which is what those metrics entail. What we're actually trying to increase is still a matter of some debate, and it's something that's being worked on and something that we will look at later, particularly how, what kinds of data streams we're looking at to incorporate into Mystic. And yes, open entails more than just open source. It also includes open data, open literature materials. Yeah. Now for our discovery process, Mystic is our open source community health analytics tool. It is built on the Linux Foundation's Grimoire Lab stack. And what it does is it utilizes different open source tools and community platforms that our research fellows use for their research streams. So, that might include their GitHub repositories, that might include their open data repositories, and that might include community management tools like Slack or Mattermost. And what it does is it pulls in data from all these different sources and delivers it to them in sort of a dashboard view, so they can look at those metrics and how they're growing and use it to grow their projects even more, and also to report on the metrics of that growth for future grant, promotion, and tenure applications. So what we did here, and where a lot of the content for this talk came from, was we interviewed the different research fellows that we've had so far for feedback on the Mystic project and for new ideas moving forward that we can utilize for that project. So what did we set out to learn? We set out to learn what kinds of open artifacts the different researchers were producing. So again, those mean things like GitHub repositories, the data repositories. Those meant other things too, like different research published in open journals. Some professors had less conventional things, Google Drives. There were a few books that were published in the open that were freely available to anyone, and other open artifacts like that. We also wanted to learn more about the different community management tools they were using, so like Slack and Mattermost, and other tools like that, with how much they were using email, what tools they used to keep in touch with others in their specific field. And we also wanted to figure out what open impact and dissemination metrics they were using now, and which ones they would like to use in the future. And for that, we got a few different answers that I'll go into in a minute. What did we learn? Well, as you may know now, most of academia is driven by citations. So every professor that we talked to really just echoed similar things when we asked about what kinds of metrics are tied to their grant and promotion application. Now they said citations. And it wasn't always said as a good thing, right? So, they all had varying opinions on whether or not citations were a good way to measure their work or a bad way to measure their work. Some of them had specific reasons as to why citations didn't match what they were doing. Some of them, it was a lot simpler, more the hard science professors like chemistry and biology. For them, citations made a lot of sense because, they do their research and they publish their papers, and that results in more citations. But for people like in computer science, software development, things like that, citations made less sense because then when they put out their research, papers were kind of an accessory to the work. It was really the GitHub repository that encompassed the bulk of what they did. But the metrics tied to the success of their GitHub repository weren't really important to like their career progression. So we really got a lot of different opinions about the whole thing, but the takeaway was that everyone knew about citations, everyone had an opinion about citations, and that those opinions were mixed. What else did we learn? Well, we learned in software development, in computer science, and other fields, some of the professors were interested in utilizing pull requests and GitHub stars as something that could be used for, as metrics to present for different grant and promotion applications. One concern they had with that, though, was that these specific metrics wouldn't be well understood if they were to utilize them. So, you can say I have 10 pull requests this month, and I have 20 GitHub stars, and maybe that's impressive to one person, maybe it's not. Maybe it's not so impressive to another person. But really, we have no barometer by which to measure those metrics. So as much as they might be tied to the success of the project, there's really no yardstick to say you're doing a good job or you're not doing a good job. Another professor who started an open journal here at RIT where other professors can publish their papers, he wanted to measure his success metrics in the open on things tied to that journal ecosystem and also to different co-op opportunities he was able to get for students. So here at RIT, we have a co-op program attached to most of the majors that you can go through. So they have a required sort of an internship bit where you have to complete that in order to graduate. So he wanted to take the number of co-ops he got for students, the number of co-op blocks, is like the time they do it for, and use that as a metric to justify his work and his career progression. We talked to a few different professors that were really outside of the scope of maybe what you might consider typical academic work. One was worked in performing arts, and really the only metric she was concerned with was along the lines of audience draw and the number of people who came to the performances and the art shows that she put on. And obviously there were, I mean, there's certain other parts attached to that. You know, where are they happening, and you know who's coming. Maybe if it's trying to draw specific people, um, but really it was all built around the her performances and what kind of, you know, audience and group and venue and all of that drew. Then we had another professor who was working with a local zoo to connect sort of the donations that you could give in front of a specific exhibit and connect those donations to conservation efforts, you know, across the world somewhere, so that when you donated a certain amount of money in front of the lemur exhibit, for example, it would be able to tell you exactly, you know, what you were doing for the lemurs in sort of, you know, measurable metrics. You were saving so many lemurs because you were donating so much money. And so that research stream, he wanted to use different metrics that were attached to the implementation of that sort of product for the zoo. And so these really encompassed a completely new dimension for the different open metrics that could be used, and more along the lines of industry metrics. So now for the TLDR, sort of a summary of everything so far. Um, you know, what does this mean for you? There'll be new open source communities built around these different research streams that will be driven primarily by the researchers who are now being incentivized to create them, to manage them, and to grow them. This is also going to result in faster tech transfer from academia to industry, because now those researchers who were previously incentivized in certain ways to, you know, keep their work to themselves up until a certain point, they're now being incentivized to share, you know, as fast as possible so that they can drive up those open metrics as much as they possibly can. So, you know, because they're judged based on how much people are able to adopt the things that they're building, obviously they're going to make them easier for people to adopt. Um, this is also going to create new dynamics both in open science and in open source, as these different existing communities, for example, the National Institute of Health has certain requirements around publishing in the Open RIT. With different communities like that, as well as the existing open source community, we're going to see a lot of these different communities come together and then see some sort of the friction and the results of those things merging. So now implications for the future. Uh, so research will gradually become less novel and more practical as a result of these different incentivization changes. So because the researchers are, you know, judged based on the metrics that are tied to people utilizing their research, obviously it decreases the value of novelty, which is really what's valued now, and increases the emphasis on practicality. If they go through the research stream and it isn't something that produces anything usable for, you know, business or some other organization, then they're not going to be rewarded as much as someone who's developing something that's more practical, and that, you know, certain industry groups and other organizations will be able to use and sort of funnel the resources that will drive their open metrics up. As a consequence of that, though, academic research will cede some decision-making power to external actors. So as it stands now, with the primary emphasis being on incentivizing citations, researchers are primarily driven to make their research more usable and useful to other researchers. You know, as their incentivization metrics shift to things related to, you know, the open and in their community building, that's going to lead to external actors who have lots of resources to throw at these projects to use them. They're going to start having some say in which projects get to continue and which projects don't. Particularly, you know, a larger business who becomes interested in a particular research stream that might produce some new technology that will be useful for their business, the number of you know, man hours and time that they can throw at touching that project and implementing it in different ways and using it and exploring it, that's going to drive up the metrics that the researcher is counting on to, you know, get their grants and their tenures and whatnot. So in that sense, research will start to cede some decision-making power that was previously, you know, internal only to, you know, higher ups in academia or other researchers, they'll start to shift that over to these larger organizations who can drive up those metrics more easily. Thank you for your time. That was my talk. If you have any questions, please reach out at my email. You can see there. And if you want to check out more about Open RIT, check us out at the link down below, openr.it. Thank you again.